Hello again. Here we are to continue talking about UIKit and Swift. And in this video, we're going to cover constraints. Okay, so we're just going to scratch the surface. Constraints are pretty involved, so they have a lot to talk about, but this should get you started with constraints. Okay. In the previous video, we set up our Xcode project. So if you haven't done that, you can watch that video and follow it through here, right? Okay, so I've already created a simple Xcode project and I have a couple UI elements on the screen here. Actually, maybe I'll even recreate those here. I'm going to open up I'm going to go to View and open up the library, right? We'll go to Show Library or Shift Command L. And I'm going to drag, this is a library of all the user interface elements. So I'm going to drag a UI label into my project. I'll open the library again and drag a button into the project, right? Okay. And if I test my project on an iPhone 8, I got the iPhone 8 selected here from the menu. So that'll be what we simulate on. And when I click Run, it's going to build my project, install it on the simulated iPhone, and then we'll see the app on the iPhone. Hey, there it is, right? So it doesn't quite look right. So one, the label is not in the center, and two, the button is off the screen. So the distance from here to here is the same as what I have in the iPhone 8, and the distance from here to here is the same as across, right? And the button here is far enough down where we can't see it, right? So how do we, ideally what we want is we want this button to always be the same distance from the bottom edge of the screen, no matter how big the phone is, right? And then maybe we want to position this the same way, like relative to the size of the screen, right? So to do that, what we need to do is set up some constraints, right? So let's talk about this for a minute. Actually, before we do that, let's configure the button and the label, right? So when you click on an element in Storyboard, you'll see if you click on this thing right here, it looks like a bunch of little sliding controls. This shows you the attribute inspector, and it gives you all the information, all of the properties for this label. So the label and the button and all the other things on the object palette, those are all actually UI view elements or subclasses of UI view, right? So there's actually code and you can generate those elements with code, but Storyboard allows us to do it graphically by dragging them around, right? And these are all of the methods and properties inside those objects, right? Those code objects, but Storyboard is just giving us access to those features, right? And we can set them here. So, for example, like let's say I like my label, but what I want to do is change the text. So I'm going to go to text here and I'll say, hello world, and you can see the text changes, right? And then below that I have color. So maybe I want to change the color of the text. So I'll choose, system purple color. Right now it's purple. And then you can choose a font, right? And the font thing has a couple options. If you click on this little T thing, it pops up a little dialog box. And the menu here allows you to pick one of the default font styles that's built in. So I'll choose large title, okay? And if you want to set a custom font, you can go up to custom at the top and then customize it. Below that we have alignment, so I'll align the text on the center, I'll drag it to the middle, right? And then there's a whole bunch of other properties, right? So you can set all those. Let's check out the button. So the button is the same way. If I click on button down here, and actually, notice that this has little control handles too. So you can also set some of the properties by dragging, right? So I'm going to drag the control handles there to make my button a little bit bigger. And here I can choose font style. So maybe I'll choose, let's do headline as my font style. You can choose shadow color, text color. Maybe I'll choose secondary system background color. So that makes the text like a really light gray. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to go all the way to the bottom. There's a whole bunch of properties, right? So we can't go over all these here, but you can explore them and experiment. I'm going to go down to background color, and then I'll set the background color to be green maybe. right? So then that doesn't look too bad, right? Maybe this button, maybe it should be really big. I really want people to tap on this button, so I'm going to make it super giant like this, right? There we go. Something like that, right? Maybe a little taller. Okay, so there's my button. So all the user interface elements have properties, and some of them have different properties. Some of them more properties, some of them have less. Some properties are very specific to some elements, and some elements share the same properties that everybody else has. Okay, so you can explore these. It's, you know, it would be like a whole, we could spend all year just going over every single property, but I think you can kind of dig through these and kind of find what you want, right? And then experiment. So now let's talk about constraints. So if you recall, I'm going to actually stop the simulator and then run it again. And as you recall, our app right here is not displaying the things the way that we want them displayed, right? So really what I want is I want Hello World to be dead center in the screen, and I want this green button to always be at the bottom edge, okay? So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to define some constraints. So in order to display something on the screen, the computer needs to know 4 pieces of information, or, you know, I should say Storyboard needs to know 4 pieces of information, okay? It needs to know the width of the element, the height of the element, and then it needs to know its horizontal position and its vertical position. Okay, let's go over that again. 4 pieces of information. So to understand constraints, you're always answering these 4 questions. How wide is my element? How tall is the element? Where is it on the horizontal axis? And where is it on the vertical axis? Okay? So, you know, and sometimes you won't need to answer all 4 questions. So there's certain cases where, and you'll kind of get this as you work with the constraints. It depends on the element, and it depends upon the constraints that you're using. Okay, so it's hard to offer a solution to everything right now, but in some cases you won't need to include all 4 pieces of information, because sometimes including 2 of them will be enough, or sometimes you'll have 4 or 5, you know, constraints, and those constraints will come up with the 4 answers for you, right? Let me give you a quick example. Some of the user interface elements have an intrinsic height and width. In other words, it has a fixed height and width, and the computer always knows how big the element is. So for example, the UI switch has an intrinsic height and an intrinsic width. So we don't really change the size of it, it's always the same size. So in that case, we can just set the horizontal and vertical position, right? And then the computer knows the intrinsic size, okay? Sometimes, like for example with the button here, you might set a constraint that sets the distance to the leading edge and the distance to the trailing edge, right? So those 2 constraints both determine the width and the position, right? Because the position of the object will be between this point and this point, right? And the width of it might grow or shrink depending on how wide the screen is, but it's going to be determined by, you know, starting here and then ending with this distance from the right edge, okay? And the height could be determined the same way. So we could say the height is fixed, but then it has a location that's a distance from the bottom, okay? So, you know, there's some ideas. You're going to have to practice with the constraints, and they'll start to make more sense the more you learn about them, okay? Let's try some constraints out. So how do you set a constraint? So there's a couple ways to do this. I'm going to do it with the user interface, right? Like clicking with the mouse. What you're going to do is hold the control key on the keyboard. Did you hear that? I just pressed it, right? And I'm going to click on the UI label, and then I'm going to drag upward, and you'll see a little line comes out. And if I click here, if I drag it up like this, you'll see that it's on top of the label, and so the label is highlighted. But if I drag outside, then the background view is highlighted. So I'm going to drag up into the background view and then let go. And Xcode's going to show me a menu, and it's going to ask me a question. It's like, as I just said, like, hey, I'm trying to create a constraint, and then it's going to say, like, what kind of constraint do you want to make? So do you want to create a top space to safe area constraint? So in other words, do I want a constraint that always keeps the distance from the top of this the same as the distance from here to the safe area at the top. So safe area is like below the notch, okay? Or space to bottom, or center horizontally in safe area. Remember earlier I said I wanted this always to be in the center of the screen. So I'm going to choose center vertically in safe area. Okay, and then you can see I've got a orange line here. So the orange line is a constraint, and it's actually an object. You can click on it and get properties about it and edit those properties. Okay, and orange means that it's not quite satisfied. So I've created some constraints, but the orange is telling me that the constraints have not been satisfied, right? So I know where we are vertically, but I don't know the width, I don't know the height, and I don't know the horizontal position yet. So I got 1 out of the 3. Let's do that again. I'm going to click on this and then do me a favor, don't click exactly on the constraint. Click on the label, right? And then control key and then drag. And I'm going to drag down into the view, and then it's going to show me the constraint I currently have, and then I'm going to add center horizontally in safe area. And then you'll see I have another constraint here. This one's blue, so that one's kind of satisfied, right? Okay, the orange one isn't quite good enough yet. So we have 2. I know where I'm at horizontally and where I'm at vertically, but I don't know the width and the height. And I think what it's telling me here is it kind of understands a little bit about how to center this thing, but it doesn't quite know how to set the vertical position yet, right? So I'm also thinking, like, what if I change the text here and it might get larger or smaller? So I'm going to make the text a little bit bigger here, the label. So I'm going to grab the center box there on the edge and drag it out like this until it aligns with the button. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to say this thing should be as wide as it is, but it should always be the distance here between this edge and the edge of the phone, and this edge and the edge of the phone. I want to keep that margin on the outside there. So to do that, I'm going to hold the control key, drag out from the object into the phone area so I see that the phone is highlighted. And then I'm going to choose leading space to safe area. And you may have noticed that depending on the direction that you drag the constraint, the menu changes. Okay, so I'm getting leading area here this time. You'll notice if I drag upward, right, it says top space. It doesn't show me leading area, right? If you just click outside, it'll put the menu away without choosing anything. So let's add a trailing constraint. Why don't you do that one? Okay. So how did you do? Let me try it, right? So I'm going to hold the control key and drag out like this, and then I'll choose trailing space to safe area. Okay. So that should be enough constraints, and you'll see these constraints are blue, but I still have some orange in there. And I think what the orange is telling us is that it's saying, like, hey, you know, your constraints are there, but actually what you're seeing in the view doesn't match the constraints. Okay. And so to fix that, what we'll do is we'll click on this little button over here. So this first button right here, if I hover over it, it says update frames. And what that means is it's going to update the frame or the outline for the object to match what the constraints say it is. So in other words, like, I could draw something here, but it may not match exactly the way the computer would render it. Okay, so now when I click the button here, it's going to match. Okay, so there we go. Let's test our code. So I'm gonna and actually this writes code behind the scenes. You don't see it, but it's written, right? So I'm gonna click on the play button here, and we'll stop the previous app and open our app up. Oh, look, and then we've got our hello world, and it's dead center on the screen, even though it's a different size screen. Okay, let's do the same thing with the button. So here's my challenge to you is I want you to position the button here, right at the bottom of the screen, and it always wants to be this distance from the bottom, and then it always wants to be this distance from the left and the right edge. And then you can set the height of the button to the current height, okay? So give that a try on your own, and then I'll walk through the solution. You can stop the video while you do that. Okay, awesome. So how did you do? Let's pardon me, sorry. Let's try that, right? So I'm going to start by adding a constraint to the bottom. So I'll click in here, use the control key, and drag down to where I just get into the phone area, right? And I'll choose space from bottom, okay? And then I'm going to set the left and the right constraints. So I'll click option or control click and drag and choose leading space. And then I'll do the same on the right side. So I'll hold the control key, click and drag outside here and choose trailing. Okay. So that's pretty good, but I think I'm still missing one constraint. So from this information, the computer knows the width, the horizontal position, and the vertical position, but it doesn't know the height. So to set the height, I'm going to control click and drag up, but I'm going to drag inside the button and then choose height as an option. So that way my button always has the correct height. And if the frame was not right, like if I did this, you can see it looks orange right there. If I click on this button, it'll resize the frame to match. Okay, so let's give it a try. So what if I stop the previous app and then click the run button again and see what happens? So it'll build. Oh, there we go. So now here this button is always there at the bottom and this thing is always in the center. Okay. So anyway, so that's an introduction to constraints. Constraints are pretty deep. There's a lot involved there, right? Let me show one more thing before we end this video. So sometimes you're going to run into a problem where you make a constraint and you want to delete it, okay? So what you can do is you can, if you click on the element, the constraints show up as these little blue lines. They're a little hard to click on, but if you hover over them, you can see it kind of gets highlighted there. You can actually click on them and delete them. Okay, did you see that? Right, I just clicked on that guy and I just went boom, gone. Okay, it's no longer there. Undo and I can put it back, right? So that's one way to delete a constraint. So if you make a constraint and you want to get rid of it, you can do that. The other thing you can do is if you click on an element, not the constraint, but the element. So here I clicked on the button, here I clicked on the label, okay? If you go to the right bar right here, this right area, and you click on this little triangle, it looks like a T-square or like a triangle for drawing, right? You know, a drafting triangle, right? And this shows you information about the frame and the constraints, like the size and position of your element, right? And if I scroll down here, you can see that I have constraints here, right? So here's my horizontal constraint is align center X to safe area. Here's a constraint on the right edge, align trailing to safe area equals 31, right? Align leading to safe area equals 31, right? And then this one is align Y to safe area, right? You can actually click the edit button and you can edit the constraint. So for example, if 31 was not a good number, like I thought that actually should have been more like 20, you know, I can just change the number to 20 and then I can go in here and edit and change this to 20, right? And there we go, updated on the screen, right? You know, and you can also delete them here. So if you click on them and it kind of becomes highlighted, you can hit delete on the keyboard to delete it. Oh, gone. Actually, I'm going to put that back. Let me do this. Let me do, I guess you can't undo that. Whoa, let me do this. Let's do center in safe area. So I'm going to add that one back in. So now we got it back, right? So you can delete the constraints that way. I say delete because actually sometimes you want to get rid of them. Like you make one and then you're like, oh, that's not the constraint that I meant to do. Trust me, it happens more often than you'd think, right? So here's a challenge for you right now, just for fun. I changed the spacing here to 20. So I think I want this button to also be 20 pixels or 20 points from the left and right edge. So why don't you try and change those yourself? Okay, so you can stop the video too. So how did you do? Okay, here's how I would do it, right? I'm going to click on the button and then I'll find the constraints tab or the frame tab here, right? And then I'm going to scroll down and find my 4 constraints. And then I'll find trailing edge right here that says 31 and I'll click edit and change it to 20. And then I'll find the leading edge, click edit. You got to click the little edit text, right? And then type in 20 as the value, okay? And there we go, updated, nice. So now these guys match, okay? So anyway, so thanks for watching. Again, there's a lot more involved with constraints, but that should get us started. The big concept here is that every object on the screen, in order for the computer to be, or for the view controller to be able to position the element on the screen, it needs to know the width, the height, the horizontal position, and the vertical position. And if that can be determined by the constraints you've chosen, then it will be good to go and everything will work out, okay? So thanks for watching, and then we'll continue in the next video.